Good afternoon and welcome to this broadcast from Cardiff Metropolitan University. Prynhawn da a chroeso i'r darllediad hwn gan Brifysgol Metropolitan Caerdydd. It's midday and time for the third episode of our summer professional webinar series produced by the Cardiff Partnership for Initial Teacher Education and originally broadcast earlier this academic year. Your presenter today is Emeritus Professor David Egan from Cardiff Metropolitan University, and the webinar is introduced by the Director of Teacher Education and Professional Learning, Dr Anna Bryant.
Croeso mawr I Bartneriaeth Caerdydd, a mae'n bleser heno I ni gyflwyno trydydd webinar yn y gyfres eleni. A warm welcome to you all to the third in the series of this Cardiff IT Partnership Research Webinars, which focuses today on developing an evidence-informed teaching profession, why and how, and it will feature Professor David Egan and extracts from teachers. For those of you perhaps who don't know, I'm Anna Bryant and the Director of Teacher Education and Professional Learning here at Cardiff Met and the Cardiff Partnership. And as you're probably aware, one of the key purposes of these webinars is really to support a discussion on how research and professional practice talk to each other. Essentially, what lies within our research-informed clinical practice model. We do really hope that these sessions will stimulate a collaborative professional learning discussion, perhaps in your school or with staff in HEI or amongst each other as IT student teachers, and even with pupils around this agenda. And I guess also hopefully result in us being even more aware of the current Welsh education landscape. As a reminder, all of the webinars are recorded and available on the Teams link you clicked for the month after the webinar. After that, then you can access all of the webinars through our Cardiff IT Partnership team site. And we've uploaded the presentations from the first couple of webinars here also. Tonight, we will dedicate the last 20 minutes of the session to answer some questions you have submitted. So please submit your questions in the chat throughout the session tonight. And if you don't mind, if you can make a note of your role, whether you're a student teacher, senior mentor, research champion, university tutor, and then Rhian Mulligan, my colleague, will be picking these up and asking Professor David Egan. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor David Egan. David is an Emeritus Professor at the Cardiff School of Education and Social Policy at Cardiff Met, and he's currently seconded to Welsh Government to develop the National Strategy for Education, Research and Inquiry. David really has a wealth of experience from his days as a school teacher and school leader of over 13 years. After this, he joined the university and worked in initial teacher education before his career progressed into senior leadership roles within the Cardiff School of Education and Social Policy, and subsequently then into educational research. He has worked extensively with central and local government, schools, and with a range of national organisations in Wales. So croeso mawr, David Egan, and I'll pass over to you.
Diolch, Anna, and thanks very much indeed. Sorry you can't see me. When we did the trial last week, my camera was working, but it seems to have given up on me this afternoon. Prynhawn da, thanks for the invitation. It's always great to come back home to Cardiff Met. There's no better place to come home to. And thanks for attending, those of you out there who are attending. And thanks for that introduction, Anna. You're very kind. I always remember when I once introduced Professor Iram Siraj, the great researcher into early years education, that she said, "Thank you for that introduction, David. I'm really looking forward now to hearing myself speak." So I hope that's I hope I can live up to that. Okay, you're going to hear me through this presentation. But there's also going to be two intervals, not musical intervals, unfortunately, but two video extracts when you'll hear from leaders and teachers in three research schools in England. The North Yorkshire Coastal Research School, the Cairo Research School, which is in Lincolnshire and the East Midlands, and Sandringham Research School, which is in St Albans in Hertfordshire. And you may wonder why I'm using video extracts from three schools in England, but hopefully that will become clear as we move along. So let me start with some definitions, because I'm going to be using terms here. You know, remember that what I'm focusing on then is developing an evidence-informed profession. Why should we be trying to do that? Why have we been trying so long to do it, in fact? How can we do it? How can we move it forward in Wales? Well, I think it's important to start with some definitions. So I'm not going to read those out. You can see them on the screen, but you'll see that I've highlighted in that definition of profession and professionalism from the Professional Standards Council, the emphasis there on learning that's derived from research, evaluation and training at a high level. So I think that concept of research is key to professionalism. You'll see there from the Chartered College of Teachers, I'm pleased to be a founding fellow of the Chartered College of Teachers. I'm afraid it's an organisation that only recruits teachers in England currently, something perhaps we ought to think about in Wales, although I know Welsh teachers do access their website and its very rich resources. But what they define evidence-based practice as being about, again, academic research as well as professional experience, judgment, evidence and data. And then professional inquiry, which is a term that we're using more and more in Wales. I take there from Scotland, their definition of professional inquiry as a finding out, but something that has a rationale, an approach that can be explained or defended. So there's some rigor, robustness about that concept. So I think those definitions for me are an important starting point. The plan then for this is quite simply to put in front of you what I think is the challenge for us as a profession. Yeah. And when I say profession, I mean the whole profession. I mean teachers, of course. I mean support staff as well. There's more support staff in primary schools now than there are teachers, and we're trying to professionalize them, and large numbers, of course, in secondary schools. I also include people who work in our regional education consortia and local authorities, of course, people who work in initial teacher education, and I think we should include, former teachers who work in Estin and other parts of our system. I mean the whole profession. So that challenge, how do we make that whole profession much more kind of evidence-informed, evidence-based, respecting research, involving themselves in professional inquiry? How do we respond to that challenge in Wales? So first of all, then the challenge. And, I always start with this man. If somebody ever said to me, who's your favourite person who writes on education, then it would be Richard Elmore, who is at the Harvard School of Education, Harvard University. And very difficult to kind of define Richard's field of work. I mean, he writes about leadership, he writes about school improvement. He's a great, I think, theorist and thinker about education, but I think he's the most eloquent and elegant writer that we have about education. In his book, Improvement of Teaching at Scale, he said, teaching is a profession, but without a practice. So go back, I won't go back in the slides, but go back to those definitions of profession. And his argument is that we are a profession. We do all the things that we should do as professionals, but we don't have a practice. When I first read that, I felt quite aggrieved about it. I felt quite, as a person who'd been a teacher and a school leader for 13 years, I thought, hang on, why is this man telling me that I don't have a practice? The more that I've thought about what Richard had to say, and that's what he does for me, gets me thinking, the more I realise what he was trying to say. And I think what he was trying to say was this. This is a much more recent piece of research that was done by researchers at the National Foundation for Educational Research for the Education Endowment Foundation. And what they were looking at, as you can see, was teachers' engagement with research. The conclusion they came to was not actually a very positive one, because in a sense, they were getting behind what Elmore had been arguing those years before. Teachers only had a small to moderate, academic research, only a small to moderate influence on teachers. Much more profound was what they drew from their own practice and the practice of other teachers. Nothing wrong with that. I certainly did that as a teacher, but also the experience of other teacher schools through non-research based CPD. There's nothing wrong with professional knowledge, nothing wrong with that at all. But I think we have to accept, if you accept this research and Elmore's challenge, that we are a profession that is much more on that side of the equation learning from others, learning from what is there called CPD, we prefer to call professional learning in Wales now, that doesn't have a strong basis in research. So I don't think we can argue that at this point in time that we can really say that Richard Elmore's challenge has been met and that we are a research-based profession. Open to challenge on that. Of course, it's always interesting then to compare ourselves, say, with health. I think it's an unfair comparison, but it's made quite often. And what you have here is another real challenge from somebody who is part of the Campbell collaboration within the health research community, the body that takes, research from all around the world and then in a systematic way summarizes it so that health professionals can use that research in their everyday practice. That's the point of the Campbell collaboration. And in a recent book that Stephen Gorard, very, very useful book, thoroughly recommend it, that Stephen Gorard, who used to work in Wales at Cardiff University, is now at Durham. In Stephen's book, they're Getting Evidence into Education. Thoroughly recommend it to you. This chap, Howard White, I think, argues from the perspective of health, that's the situation in education. And of course, a lot of the focus that there's been recently on the wonders that health research has produced in terms of the vaccine and all the various kind of therapies that have been developed to meet this dreadful pandemic, this dreadful virus that we've all been going through. Obviously we can see in Wales that health research is way, way ahead of education research, both in the quality, the quantity of it, and its reach, the way that it informs professional practice. I think the comparison sometimes between health and education is overdone. I'm not a fan of the kind of what works type of approach to education research, and that's a very strong paradigm, of course, within health. But nevertheless, I think it's part of this challenge that I'm sort of building up for us as a profession. And you could say there's nothing new about all of this. Back in 1849, I'm an historian by background and training before I became an educational researcher, and I still think a lot as an historian. Back in 1849, the first model school was set up in Carmarthen. And it was intended to bring the very best teachers to teach in that school so that they could demonstrate the very best teaching methods to student teachers, because it was closely linked with Trinity College Carmarthen, and it's still there, the model school, and still used for teaching experiences. But that, again, was an idea back in the kind of early Victorian period of actually saying that we could know what best practice was, what good practice was. Well, I'm not sure that was the case, but it's a long-standing argument. When I became a teacher at Treorchy Comprehensive School in 1976, and I was one of 3 teachers in the school at that time that were trying to finish their PhDs part-time. And we used to get a terrible ribbing, in the way that teacher banter takes place in staff rooms. I can remember being told that I was an example of the long-haired and flared bottom generation. Well, I had some hair then, haven't got much hair now, and it was quite long. I don't think I wore flared bottoms, but I always remember that being, as it were, the kind of view that we were these 3 young teachers in the school who were trying desperately to finish our PhDs, 2 in history and 1 in English, whilst becoming teachers, that we were almost something arcane or unusual. That was the professional kind of reception that you got at that time. In 1996, in a famous lecture, Professor David Hargreaves, teaching as a research-based profession, challenged again the education profession and education researchers to produce useful research that teachers could use in their practice. That kicked off a huge furore. I'd become an educational researcher by that time, and certainly it was a very challenging approach that David set out before us. Ben Goldacre, arguing from the medical perspective in 2013, said that education needed to use the medical example of randomized control trials, actually being brave enough to test out educational ideas, educational research on children in practice through randomized control trials, RCTs. I've always thought it would be an interesting thing to do an RCT in RCT, which is where I'm sitting today at home in Pontypridd. But there we are, that's not happened. And of course, the Education Endowment Foundation in England, this independent but vastly funded body by the English government, has adopted that as part of its standard practice. Educational researchers working with schools all over England and teachers all over England to carry out randomized controlled trials. And you can go to their website and you can see the outcomes of that. My professional organisation, BERA, the British Educational Research Association, if you're interested in educational research, you should join that. A few years ago now, published an important body of work on close to practice research, how we should be making sure that educational research was as close to professional practice as possible. Currently, the British Academy and the Royal Societies are carrying out a major piece of work which is ongoing on educational research in the UK. I was at a seminar last week that they'd organised with teachers in England. Unfortunately, there were none there from Wales because they haven't invited them. And of course now, what I'm heavily involved in is developing a national strategy for educational research and inquiry in Wales. So, you know, we're back on the case, but this is not a new conversation. Then the why question. I'll come to the how question in a minute, but then the why question. Well, I suppose you could turn to Estyn. Why wouldn't you turn to Estyn? And this is what Maile Rowlands, the Chief Inspector of Schools, who is a former colleague of ours at Cardiff Met, what Maile in that annual report reflected upon when he was reflecting on the evidence that had been brought before him on the previous year of education in Wales. Most effective schools, leaders take a critical and informed view of research evidence. The best schools use evidence-based research methods to evaluate learning and teaching. So what Estyn are telling us is a little bit more positive, perhaps, than my starting point, but they're telling us that it's only the best schools. They don't say how many schools, but they only say the best schools, the most effective schools. So what we know is that there are pockets, in their view, in Estyn's view, pockets of good practice within the system. I prefer to draw on the head of another research school, Huntington Research School in York, who unfortunately we didn't record when we were there recently. But John Tomset, I followed John's writings for many, many years. John, the head there, said that what made that school, it's a comprehensive school in York, what made that school the great school that it is now, and everybody thinks it is a great school, from the school that he first came to, which was a very, very low achieving school, is that they decided to stop doing silly things. I think a very telling phrase. When he got there, he said we were doing dozens of different things and the school was getting worse year on year. We threw them all out. We turned to research evidence. We looked at where the best research evidence was and we used that and we stopped doing silly things. And he says we made teaching intellectually interesting. And his staff retention and the promotions that have taken place from his school because of that journey that he's taken his teachers on, I think have been a remarkable one as well. So I think the why question can, I think, be answered in that way. OK, so how do we respond in Wales? Well, here's the first research school interval. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rhian, who hopefully will be able to play you a video of the visits that some of us, I and a group of head teachers from Wales, made recently to these research schools in England. And if you want to find out more about the research school movement, then just Google, the Research School Network or Google Education Endowment Foundation, and that will take you to it. That's the kind of the link.
Crucially, it's really around the translation of research evidence to practice, because we are, like much as, yes, we are research school leads and heads of sixth form and things like that, we are ultimately teachers, and I think there's real power in that, because we will be reading research evidence and we will be thinking about applying it to practice in our own classrooms, but more generally in our school. And we can really look at some of those knotty issues as you translate research evidence into practice, which I think is really helpful with regard to communication and supporting training and implementation in other contexts.
Our ethos is to share, or our basis is to be able to bridge the gap between research that's going on academically and actually make that of some use, so that and share that information so that schools can use that information, and actually all the academic research that's happening and can help schools make better choices and better decisions actually gets to schools. So we're kind of bridging that gap. Research that we do now is like evaluations, where there's big projects and we'll be the independent evaluator. So we do research in that sense, at looking at whether things have worked like that. But before, we were doing a lot of kind of action research, small scale research in school.
Lessons that we've learned kind of as a team working together, I think we've found that it's been invaluable to have dedicated time to read research evidence and explore that and think about translation into the classroom. So we are very grateful to the timetabler at Sandringham, because over the years they've been able to make available at least one day where we are all together as a team, and we meet our coordinator. We go through obviously an agenda and business and things arising, but we do actually have space then to really think about the research evidence, and then that feeds into our work. So that work might be, for example, blogs, which would be as part of our communication channel. So just we have a website, all the research schools have a website. So this is ours, for example, and then there's a range of resources here. But one page that we use quite a lot is our blogs. So we would, be regularly kind of reflecting on key themes and, trying to communicate lessons from research evidence. And that's really important, I think, to do that together. Not to say that we can't do that kind of work on our own, but I think as a team that's quite important. And I think particularly when it comes to designing and adapting training courses, that's really, really important to think about, not just that, obviously the content and the research evidence, the implications, etc., but also decisions about facilitation to make sure that the work that we do has impact.
The key characteristics of being a research school that have made a difference to everyday practice. Differences to our everyday practice in school is it's completely redeveloped our school development planning and our observations in class. That's been completely changed. So we have, when we do our school development planning now, we very much root it in what are our issues, not what shiny thing we've just seen that they're doing down the road. We look for our issues. Everybody is involved in drawing that development plan up together. I don't feel anymore like I need to know all the answers and go and tell my staff what the answers are. That's not my job, and it's really made me realise that. My job is that I look through the data and we all talk anecdotally as well as from the data and what's going on in class about what we need to work on. And then we all go away and look at the evidence together and we make a decision together about what would work for us. And I don't have to be an expert in everything. And it's made me realise that that's not what I'm there to do. I shouldn't know the answer to everything, but I should know who we can ask and where we can get help from, that we can all decide together how we can make it move forward as a school. And then all our observations, all our performance management are all based around what those identified areas. And they're all right. We all decided that we would do this together because the evidence says that this would work. Are we doing it? But then equally, if we get to the end of the year and we said, yeah, we did it amazingly, but the results aren't any better, then we'll look again at how that, what we can do next week, kind of thing, if that makes sense. Or next year, sorry, and how we can change it.
The reading project was firmly based on data and needs of the schools. So we're working with priority schools, which is obviously funded by the EEF. We analysed the data first of all of the priority schools within Lincolnshire, and it became apparent that reading was a particular area of a weakness across the schools. And when we had to do an application for the funding, we had to do an analysis of the data, which again, obviously suggested that reading was the main thing. So that's the reason why we focused on that. We also spoke to lots of schools about their issues and that, and just to make sure that we weren't misinterpreting the data. So that was very much a data-driven exercise. The University of Lincoln project was that it was, because it's the Wellcome Trust, it was around science. The University of Lincoln had kind of already come up with the idea. Where we fit in was around the delivery model. So when we came in, there wasn't a coaching element to it. We came in and said, actually, best practice might be instructional coaching in terms of the delivery. This is how we might be able to give you capacity. There was very much a remit that we kind of fitted around and kind of made suggestions in terms of what that project might look like.
Okay, I think that's the end of the first extract, so I'm going to go to my next slide, and it's the how bit now. So the why bit, I think we've covered. It's the how we respond then to this challenge. You've seen the kind of things that are going on in England, and they're interesting. Not just in England, there are things that are going on in other parts of the world as well, and we're interested in those. But how do we respond in Wales? Well, I think there are two things really to reflect upon here, and that's when I start making a distinction between research-informed schools and research-engaged schools. I'm not sure it always works as a distinction, but I think it's useful to have in mind. What I'm doing then with this National Strategy for Educational Research and Inquiry is working with all parts of the education system in Wales to develop our first strategy for educational research and inquiry, and we deliberately made it that sort of plural, research and inquiry, rather than just the singular research, when people always think instinctively of research going on in universities. Nothing wrong with that, but inquiry is something that often we locate within the profession, and I think it's important that we're inclusive in that kind of way. So there's three aspects to the work that I'm involved in: making sure that we can get this right at government level. There's a lot of work to do there. Developing our capacity in higher education, a lot of work to do there, but that's coming along very nicely at the moment, and Cardiff Met's very much part of that journey. And then developing what, in this instance, I call a research literate profession. That's the term that the British Academy and the Royal Societies have been using in the work they've been doing, a research literate profession. I use that sometimes, other times I use evidence informed or evidence-based, various ways of expressing it. Creating a research informed system, well, all of this is work in progress. When we were in a conversation today with the head teachers that I'm working with and the Education Endowment Foundation, then somebody there said, well, bringing about educational change is a bit like being part of a jazz group, And one of our head teachers from Wales said, well, with the kind of changes we're making in Wales, it's a bit more like a jazz orchestra, which I was most amused by. There's a lot going on within the Welsh education system at the moment, I mean, I haven't even put on there the changes that are taking place to the curriculum. But I mean, obviously, everything in a sense at the moment, is influenced by that. But look, these are some of the things that I think in this space that need to be considered in how we develop a research-informed system, why we're here today. ITE partnerships, which have at their heart the idea that students are being introduced to research-informed evidence in initial teacher education and going into schools where you're taking that conversation on with them. I think the research schools model is an interesting one to reflect upon and learn from. We have our leadership academy, and of course we know that the most important thing that happens in schools is teaching, but leadership is key to bringing about, as it were, the high quality teaching we need. So we must bring our leaders into this conversation as well. The role of our regional education consortia is critical within this as well. The concept of schools as learning organisations, with inquiry being one of the domains in there, has to be an important part of this conversation. And now, published last week, you may not have seen it yet, is the draft consultation document for our new accountability, school improvement, self-evaluation future in Wales. The way in which in future our consortia, challenge advisors, Estyn are going to be working. That's out there. And I'm very pleased to say that we've managed to get professional inquiry in there very strongly within self-evaluation. Very, very important that we did that, because I think schools will see now that this is not just talking the talk, it will have to become walking the walk. There's no better way to carry out self-evaluation for your school development planning processes, and in order, as it were, to inform governing bodies and inform parents and inform the consortia and ESTIN when the time comes, than professional inquiry. And so trying, as it were, to work in this space and make sense of it is where I am at the moment, but I'm on the journey. Haven't got the full answer yet. Being research engaged, in other words, not just being receivers of research and putting that research into practice, but actually participating in professional inquiry, in the research influence process. Well, we have our National Professional Inquiry Programme. Cardiff Met has been one of the lead universities for that. I worked very closely with Anna and other colleagues for the first 2 years of that. I've moved on to something else now, but it's in good hands in Cardiff Met. And 3 universities, now broadened out to 7 universities, starting with 70 professional learning pioneers, as they were called initially, now called lead inquirers. And this year, in very difficult circumstances, bringing on 300 new partnership schools. So that programme is very much part, again, of what we're thinking. Developing and sustaining this and expanding it to reach other parts of the system also has to be part of this conversation. Now then, I think we could go now, because I've just got one closing slide beyond this. I'm looking at timing. If we go and maybe have 5 minutes, Rian, I can't remember how long that this next extract is, but if you bring it back to me after 5 minutes, and then I can close.
So moving on to evidence leads in education. So we realised early on, I think after our first year, that James and I couldn't manage all the work, all the delivery, the CPD, the evidence briefings, just the 2 of us. So because the EEF in year 2 asked us to our reach, we felt we needed to start looking at the capacity, but also the sustainability for the research school, because at that point we thought we'd only got funding for 3 years, so we were getting ready for what's the legacy, and you know, trying to make sure that if we were no longer on the scene, actually that some of the work we'd done would be carried on. So we came up with the idea of designating evidence education who could be our additional capacity, help us with reach, and would be the sustainable solution. And so we advertised for existing teachers or leaders needed to still be in school, various ranges of, you know, levels of experience, but who had the skills to support others, who were also evidence informed, and probably the key thing that they were passionate about using evidence to improve their practice. So they knew what the evidence said about reading or about teaching maths, and that they would then become our frontline representatives of the research school. So we started that in 2017-18, and we now have 40 evidence leads in education who are working across the whole region. So for the map, you know, so spreading from the south bank of the Humber in North and North East Lincolnshire all the way down to Northamptonshire, we've now got 40 primary and secondary, some sixth form, and a couple of special school evidence leads in education. So they're really our workforce that we deploy. And part of the part of the process that I get involved in, particularly, is QAing the work of the ELEs, because they're representing Cairo Research School, but they're also representing the EEF as well. So we need to make sure that the ELEs are trained up, they know about the latest evidence, and that everything that they're doing complies with our expectations for delivery. So what do ELEs do, or what attributes do they need to have? So there's a real mixture of soft and hard skills. So they need to be really good at communicating. They need to be able to get alongside a teacher or head teacher to sort of support them, enable them to use evidence to effect school improvement. We ask them to be the communicators, so to deliver evidence briefings based on the EEF guidance reports, but we also train them up so that they can deliver the Research School Network training programmes. And then also the sort of the implementation and the evaluation side. So we have a couple of ELEs who are now becoming more expert in being able to deliver evaluations of other schools funded projects. So it's quite a varied range of skills that we look for, and we don't expect each ELE or each teacher that applies to be an ELE, we don't expect them to have the full set of skills, but we do expect them to have the potential to develop those skills alongside having the passion for evidence. And so we run, and I was part of the EES working group to develop the online content for a modular ELE induction programme, which we've already delivered in Lincolnshire and Leicestershire once. So this has been our solution really to make sure that we can keep going. And what do ELEs do? So I've said a few things, but there's coaching and mentoring, so instructional leadership, instructional coaching, rather, writing blogs, training, presenting to, say, groups of head teachers. So going to be our, if we've got key messages and in Lincolnshire, if there's different meetings you need to go to, in the time when we went out of school to visit places rather than it all being done online, they're the people that we call on to support us with that as well.
So look, I hope you found those extracts interesting. Now, this has been a massive topic to cover in 40 minutes. I mean, all speakers say that, don't they? But I think it has. The proposition, in a sense, that's before us today is that with evidence, we can have impact, we can achieve improvement. But of course, it's very difficult. It's very complex, and I hope that this hasn't come across in a simplistic way, because it's not simple. But we're on the journey. The prize is obviously the holy grail of transforming educational practice in Wales and responding to the kind of Elmore challenge, really, of making sure that we are a profession with a really research-based practice. And we're up for that in Wales. There's no doubt about it that we're up for that in Wales. So let's continue the conversation now over the next 20 minutes. Please continue it, at individual school level with me, right? And with Ellen Bristow. Ellen's a PhD student who's working with me currently as an intern, and she's looking at this in an international context. What evidence is there of the kind of things that we're talking about here today happening in other countries? But she's also interested to talk to people about practice in Wales. So please, and Ellen pulled together the video extracts for me today beyond my skill set. Also, we are running a seminar series as part of the National Strategy for Education, Research and Inquiry. Our next seminar later this month, we'll have Olkfa School from Swansea and a group of schools from Rhyl in North Wales talking about the work that they're doing to try and turn themselves into research type schools. There's my contact details at both Cardiff Met and Government Wales. Please get in touch if you want to continue this conversation, either as an individual teacher or as a school. And there's Ellen's contact details as well. She'd be very happy to talk to you and can provide you with any more information that you want. Diolch yn fawr. Back to Rhian.
Oh, diolch yn fawr iawn, David. So many important considerations there for us this afternoon. I really like that metaphor as well of the jazz orchestra. That really sang to me. I really like that one. We do have a couple of questions actually here, David. So if we just start with perhaps a focus on some tips that you might have for senior mentors or mentors in school.
Well, I think the tip is really that, you know, what we're wanting, obviously, is that this conversation that we're starting in the university is such an important entry point for this conversation, isn't it? That when they come to initial teacher education, we've always tried to do it, but I think we have more focus than ever now on the importance of research. Why would we be different to any other profession? You think of the transformation that's taken place in nursing. And I can remember when I was a secondary school teacher, you know, nurses were people who generally left school with some O levels, and generally girls, occasional boy. Now the gender issue is much more kind of equal, but now they leave after A level, they go to university, they do a nursing degree, and onward they go in their profession, because at the heart of their profession is this concept of research-informed practice. Talk to any experienced nurse these days, and this is something now that is part of their language. So please, as mentors, senior mentors, continue the conversation, join the conversation, right? Update your professional knowledge, get involved in this because we need you to, but please infuse these young student teachers and get behind the conversation that we start with them in the university. That would be my advice or my request.
Lovely, thank you, David. And a couple of other questions as well. How can schools best access recent and relevant research when perhaps so many journals are open access at the moment?
Well, I think it's a really good question, isn't it? And I think it's a fundamental question. You know, I mean, you know, some research is reasonably accessible. I mean, one of, you know, the strengths of the Education Endowment Foundation, you know, it's not going to work in Wales. It's not for us in Wales. But one of their strengths is that they do produce kind of summaries from high quality research in an accessible way. And one of the things, of course, that the research schools in England have been doing is working with partner universities. You heard mention of Lincoln University. Other universities as well, you know, were mentioned when we worked with them, who helped them to access research, but also to access it in an accessible way. You know, there's a danger sometimes, because teachers, in my experience, are hungry for knowledge, that they look for knowledge in the wrong places and they find very diluted. I'll be very sort of moderate in my words. They go to places where actually the reliability and validity of what they're seeing there in research terms, I think, is highly questionable. But that's because they have the hunger that they want, and they don't have the time to access what they feel will be useful to them. So I think that's a challenge, and I think that challenge has to be for us in Cardiff Met, and it has to be across the 8 universities in Wales, 9, let's include the Open University. I think that has to be for us. Part of what I think our role has to be over the next period is making high quality research evidence available to teachers in an accessible way. Because often, if they get that entry point, they get the hunger to go and read the full works, as it were. So I think that's a really important question, and I think it's a really strong challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And sort of following from that, really, another question from one of our PGC students. When should teachers, particularly teachers entering the profession, be doing this research? Is it more effective, Chelsea is asking, if it's done collaboratively?
The answer to that is yes. Teachers always, I think, prefer to work collaboratively. I think there's a role for individual inquiry, but I think teachers generally, I think we know, prefer to work collaboratively. When should they start? As soon as possible. You know, I mean, I just don't think that this is delayed gratification. I think this is something that basically it's back to that professional challenge again. It's back to what Elmore challenges us to do. And that is to say that it is never too late in a career, as it were, to start thinking, you know, to make teaching intellectually interesting again. that John Thompson challenge. You know, when John spoke in those terms, a number of times that I have spoken to head teachers who said to me, we just keep on being asked to do new things and we take on new things and we never throw anything out. We just do more and more and more and more and more. His argument was, look at the research evidence, look at the best bets, right? And you can find there's all sorts of ways in which you can do that, and we can help with that. Look for the best bets. Try those, see if they work for you, adapt them to your practice, and stop doing silly things. And then his argument is teaching becomes intellectually interesting. So it's never too soon.
Lovely, thank you, David. We do have a question from one of our head teachers as well, actually, just about the time constraints, really. Primary schools are very busy places, Stuart says. There are a number of research models, some short sprints and other longer spirals. What would your advice be on the length of research projects?
Well, I think when it comes to inquiry, you know, to what I called in the presentation, research engaged, being research informed, having that access that we talked about in relation to the previous question is these are related things, but that's one conversation, isn't it? This conversation about yourself becoming involved in research through inquiry, I think it's probably best to start small. You know, I mean, for me, and there's lots of advice. I mean, what I should have produced for this is a reading list, and I can produce that reading list and follow up for people, because I think there's lots and lots of practical advice out there now from, you know, teachers who've been involved in this inquiry work. And I think generally what they'll say is start small and then start to build from there. And I think as you start to build, my advice to you would be, don't try and do that alone. That's where you need the help of professional researchers from our universities. In the event that we held earlier on today around the National Professional Inquiry Programme, it was lovely to see many of the teachers that we've worked with there giving testimony to precisely that. You know, we were doing inquiry already, but once we started working with colleagues from Cardiff Met, and certain people in this conversation were mentioned, I won't give them even more love now, but they certainly were given some love there, Dr. Bryant. You know, that when they started getting involved with us, we felt much more empowered, much more skilled to step up. So make a start small, do things that you think, you know, are not too burdensome for yourself. When you want to expand that into much bigger pieces of work, I think that's when you need to reach out to people within the universities.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And I think that does actually answer another one of the questions that we've had, which is because there are so many possible and potential focus areas for research, wellbeing, assessment, and so on. You know, how do you make that decision? Where do you start, and so on? So, yeah, thank you for that. We do. I
think it's an important point, Rhiannon. I mean, I think often, you know, it might be something, you know, because it's a school improvement priority or a priority within your school development plan, or something that Estin have left you with as something to think about, or a challenge advisor. So it might be something that, you know, is there for you. But I think as well as that, you know, something that you're passionate about, or something that you're really inquisitive about. You know, we worked, didn't we, Anna, with somebody who was a student of ours and a teacher, briefly came back to work in Cardiff Met, who talked about having a professional itch. Why is it when I try all these things with this difficult class I've got and they never ever respond to what I'm doing? What is it about them? Well, stop beating them up. Stop, you know, having the conversation in the staff room about what a difficult class they are. Start talking to them and start trying to find out. So it might be something that is about your own practice. Yeah, but I think it's got to be something you're passionate about.
Yes, definitely. And I think we've got another question about, you mentioned Hargreaves challenge to make research more relevant. And do you think that this is the case now?
Yes, I do. I mean, you know, it's that kind of Elmore, you know, Hargreaves challenge, you know, that I think that for many years I was the editor of the Wales Journal of Education. And all the time I was saying we've got to get to a point where we make this journal much more accessible to that busy teacher. You know, we've got to be producing something other than what is expected of us, which is learned, scholarly, peer-reviewed articles. That's what we have to do. That's our professional kind of ethics as educational researchers, but we've got to make those products far more accessible. And now Welsh Government are actually funding the Wales Journal of Education to enable them to do that. The journal now is produced bilingually for the first time. It's open access. You don't have to subscribe to it any longer. And I know that there are, I can't see who's in this conversation today, otherwise I'd embarrass them. I know that there are head teachers who hold discussion groups around articles in the journal. They hold lunchtime research cafes, or they were before recent lockdown, where a particular article was shared with staff. So teachers are finding ways to do that, but I still think there's a responsibility for us as educational researchers and for the work we're doing in this space to make these things more accessible to teachers.
Lovely, thank you. And we do have a question as well about the right level of rigour at the moment when more time and money needs to be invested on a national level. So how do we ensure that that necessary correct level of rigour is applied to our research?
Well, I mean, the world I live in, we can't compromise on quality at all. You know, I think that quality has to be uppermost. So, you know, there are different journeys to that quality. I'm not somebody, you know, I'm an academic by background, by training. As I said, my first career was in history research, which, you know, I think is way ahead of educational research, you know, in terms of the quality. But so I think quality is critically important, and we should never compromise on quality in that academic space. There's always been a debate amongst academics, many of whom are former teachers, as to whether what comes out from professional inquiry and teacher research, action research, is of sufficient quality. I mean, I've always been irritated by that kind of discussion. I think it's a bit patronizing. I mean, I think it's horses for courses. You know, what we've been trying to do in NPEP is to say that inquiry can have the rigor of research methods and research techniques, but it can be appropriate to its context, appropriate to being close to practice. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be of good quality, because if it's of good quality, it can be shared across schools. So I think there are quality issues, but I think we need to see this as being a plural, not a singular conversation. It's that ivory towerism, I think, of some academics, I hope I'm not one of them, I try not to be, you know, that often persuades teachers that actually educational research is not for them. It is done for people with long hair and flared bottoms.
And I think actually that does tie in with one of the other questions that we've got. It's quite a vision that you paint there. It's lovely. But I'm going to hand back to Anna shortly. But just before we do, because we've been having a chat in the background as well about, you know, a couple of things related to this. One of the questions that we have here is about advice on how to share the impact of research in an accessible and engaging way within school, in terms of leadership and in terms of the wider picture.
Well, I think this is another one. There's some very good questions here today. This is another one of the really, you know, really critical questions, isn't it? Because, you know, if we want our profession to become involved in the way that I'm making the case for here today, and I think there's a hunger for this. I don't think I'm kind of sailing against the wind. You know, if we want that to happen, we've got to see teachers going on a journey, and we've seen that with that NPEP program, teachers going on a journey. Put aside whatever impact they're having on their schools or on their pupils. The journey they've gone on has been fantastic, making teaching intellectually interesting again. So I think that's important, but you can't duck the pupil level or the school improvement level challenge. You can't duck that. And I think what we have to start doing with that is some serious work around it. So Ellen, who's with me here today, was in the conversation this morning. There may be some other teachers, I don't think there are, who were in that conversation earlier, some head teachers who were in the conversation earlier, where Education Endowment Foundation took us through, for example, how the randomized control trial work they did around the role of teaching assistants and the impact that teaching assistants have on student achievement. They then took that high quality research that had been done at UCL, They did randomized control trials around it, and then they developed an implementation protocol. They developed an evaluation protocol. They developed tools for teachers to be able to use this research. You can't just expect to pass the ball, as it were, to busy head teachers and busy schools, and then you're sorted. Knowledge transfer is not like that. You've got to be prepared over a period of time to be working with schools, and that is where the impact issue comes. That's what we're up for in Wales, starting to do this in a really deep and serious way, not for it to be something that's a fad. We don't want fads, we've got enough fads, but something that is going to transform practice. And that means that we've got to do deep and sustained work in this kind of area. And the biggest challenge of all will be that impact question. And it won't be easy to answer, because it's never easy to answer when you think of all the different influences there are on pupil cognition, you know, but blimey, it's worth having a go.
I couldn't agree more. I'm going to pass you back to Anna now. Thank you ever so much for that, David. I think we've covered so many questions there, and thank you to everybody as well for submitting your questions. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Rhian and David. I think just to pick up on that last question, I think around dissemination and access to research, I think it's been really, really nice as a partnership recently to see how you as some of our student teachers out there have been sharing their PGC research assignments with schools through visual presentations and infographics. So that's been amazing to see that all the positive tweets we've seen this year on Twitter, etc. So thank you very much. It's a good sign of us really developing this research culture. So I think just to wrap up, I just want to say diolch yn fawr iawn i David. Thank you very much for a really excellent presentation, you know, that was thought-provoking and really gave us a good insight into that profession and research-informed practice here in Wales. I think I certainly feel motivated about how perhaps we can really make a difference here in Wales. And I think what was really nice was, you know, that lesson again, that we can really look around, look nationally. Let's look across the border to Scotland, to England, let's look internationally, but then draw the best bits for us to bring back to what suits us in our context in Wales. I think there were some lovely extracts and wonderful videos tonight, you know, that really brought research-informed schools to life, which was really, really nice to see. Yes, and I guess what was really also really nice tonight was to see how everybody's interacted and the excellent questions we've had in, and how we've been able to continue that discussion that David has started through his presentation. So just to round up, just to say diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd, a diolch yn fawr iawn I David heno. Really enjoyed the session. So just want to say diolch yn fawr a hwyl fawr I chi gyd. Thank you very much and enjoy your evening tonight. Hwyl.
Hwyl fawr.